The Kaldrith Empire had ruled the Orion arm of the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their ships were legends that struck fear into every species they encountered. Their warriors were unmatched in combat, and their technology was beyond the comprehension of most civilizations that still struggled with basic space travel. When their long-range scouts discovered humanity expanding beyond their home solar system and establishing colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter, the Empire's high command saw nothing more than primitives playing with fire, and they decided it was time to bring these newcomers under control before they became a nuisance. Admiral Vexnor of the Kaldrith Armada was given a simple assignment that he considered beneath his station as a decorated war hero. He was to take his personal dreadnought to this backwater system and deliver the standard ultimatum that the Empire had used successfully on 17 other species over the centuries. Submit to Imperial rule or face complete annihilation. The choice was always the same, and the result was always predictable. Most species chose survival over pride, and the few that chose to fight were crushed. Within days of their foolish resistance, the massive Kaldrith vessel dropped out of faster-than-light travel near Earth's moon and hung there like a dark omen in the sky. The ship was called the Eternal Glory, and it was over 2 miles long with weapon systems that could reduce an entire continent to ash in a matter of minutes. Its shields had never been breached in 1,000 battles, and its hull bore the scars of victory from dozens of worlds. Vexnor sat in his command, thrown on the bridge, and gazed at the blue planet below with contempt. These humans had barely reached their own moon a century ago, and now they thought they could claim the stars. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance and stared at the tactical display that showed the enormous alien vessel hovering near Luna. He was a veteran of the Mars rebellion 15 years ago when colonial separatists had tried to break away from Earth control, and he had also fought in the Titan conflicts where corporate miners had gone to war over resource claims. But nothing in his military career had prepared him for this moment. The alien ship was 10 times larger than anything humanity had ever constructed, and its energy readings were off every scale their sensors could measure. Jake was 42 years old, with graying hair at his temples and tired eyes that had seen too much combat. He had joined the United Nations Space Force 20 years ago when it was little more than a glorified Coast Guard, patrolling the space between Earth and Mars. Now he commanded one of humanity's newest warships and faced an enemy that could wipe out his entire species with ease. The Defiance was sleek and modern by human standards, with experimental weapons and engines that pushed the boundaries of known physics. But compared to the alien dreadnought, it looked like a rowboat facing an aircraft carrier. Lieutenant Amy Price sat at the communications console, and her hands trembled slightly as she worked. She was 28 years old, and this was her first real posting after graduating from the academy with top honors. She had dreamed of exploring the galaxy and making first contact with alien civilizations, but she had imagined peaceful meetings and cultural exchanges. Not this. Not a massive warship delivering what could only be a threat. The alien transmission came through, and Amy routed it to the main screen. The face that appeared was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Admiral Vexnor had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on his face, and his skin was a deep purple color, with darker ridges running across his forehead. His expression was one of complete superiority and disdain. When he spoke, the translation software struggled to keep up with his language, but the meaning was clear enough. He gave humanity 6 Earth hours to evacuate their leadership to his vessel, where they would formally surrender control of their species to the Kaldrith Empire. The Empire would assume command of all human worlds and colonies, and humanity would serve as a labor force for imperial expansion in this region of space. Any resistance would be met with immediate and total extinction. Every city would burn and every human would die. The choice was theirs, but Vexnor made it clear that he expected compliance because no species had ever been foolish enough to fight the Empire and survive. Jake listened to the ultimatum with a calm expression that hid the rage building inside him. He glanced at his tactical officer, Commander Lisa Grant, who was a 10-year veteran with sharp features and sharper instincts. She had been reviewing sensor data on the alien ship since it arrived, and she gave him a subtle nod that told him everything was ready. They had been preparing for this scenario for 2 decades, ever since the first alien probe had been detected, passing through the outer solar system. Lisa was 35 years old and had grown up in the asteroid belt. colonies where life was hard and people learned to be tougher. She had joined the military to escape the mines and discovered she had a gift for tactical analysis and combat strategy. She had helped design many of the weapon systems on the Defiance, and she knew exactly what the ship was capable of doing. Jake turned back to the screen and spoke in a steady voice that carried throughout the bridge. He told Vexnor that humanity had a counteroffer for the Empire. They had 5 minutes to leave human space and return to wherever they came from. After those 5 minutes expired, the Caldreth ship would be considered a hostile threat and dealt with accordingly. He said it calmly and professionally, as if he were discussing a minor trade dispute instead of threatening a vessel that could destroy his entire planet. Vexnor stared at him for a long moment and then began to laugh. The sound was harsh and alien, but the mockery was universal. He told Jake that his species would make adequate slaves once the Empire broke their spirit and taught them their proper place in the galactic order. The transmission ended abruptly and the screen went dark. Jake stood up from his command chair and looked around at his crew. There were 30 people on the bridge and hundreds more throughout the ship. Most of them were young and had never seen real combat. They looked scared, and he could not blame them. But they also looked determined, and that was what mattered. He opened a ship-wide channel and spoke clearly so everyone could hear him. He told them that everything they had trained for over the past 20 years had led to this moment. The Caldreth Empire thought humanity was weak and primitive. They thought humans would surrender without a fight. They were wrong. Today, humanity would show the galaxy exactly what they were made of, and why threatening Earth was the biggest mistake the Empire had ever made. He turned to Lisa and gave the order that would change human history forever. Execute Protocol Prometheus. It was time to show the Caldreth what humanity did best. What Admiral Vexnor did not know was that humanity had been watching the stars for decades and preparing for the day when they would not be alone. The detection of that first probe had sparked a military and technological revolution. Governments had poured resources into weapons research and ship construction. The best minds had worked on new technologies that combined human ingenuity with reverse-engineered alien components from the probe. And the military had trained relentlessly for a war they hoped would never come. The Caldreth did not know about the gravity mines that surrounded their position in carefully calculated patterns. They did not know about the quantum missiles hidden throughout the asteroid field, with targeting systems locked onto their hull. They did not know about the advanced cloaking technology that kept 300 human warships invisible as they moved into position around the eternal glory. And they certainly did not know that humanity had spent 20 years studying every scrap of data from that probe to learn how to kill ships, exactly like theirs. Amy Price counted down the seconds until the 5-minute deadline expired. Her voice was steady now and her hands had stopped shaking. She had made her choice. They all had. Humanity would not go quietly into slavery. They would fight and they would win, or they would die trying, but they would never surrender. The countdown reached 0 and Jake gave the order that every person on the bridge had been waiting to hear. Fire, the Caldreth dreadnought. Eternal glory had weathered 1,000 battles across 100 worlds, and its shields had never been breached by enemy fire. Its hull had never been scarred by weapons that could threaten its structural integrity. Admiral Vexnor had personally overseen the conquest of 17 species from that very bridge, and he had watched countless enemy fleets break themselves against his ship's defenses like waves against a cliff. He had seen desperation and courage and fury, but none of it had ever mattered, because the eternal glory was invincible. All of that changed in the span of 30 seconds, and Vexnor would spend the rest of his short life trying to understand how it happened. The gravity mines activated first, and they were unlike anything the Caldreth had encountered in 3,000 years of warfare. Human scientists had discovered how to create localized distortions in space itself, and the mines generated gravitational fields that twisted reality in impossible ways. The Eternal Glory's shields were designed to stop energy weapons and kinetic projectiles, but they had no defense against space itself turning inside out. The protective barrier that had never failed flickered and collapsed under the impossible physics, and suddenly the great warship was naked and vulnerable. Then came the missiles, and each one carried a payload of compressed antimatter, wrapped in a shell of experimental human alloys. The Caldreth had antimatter weapons too, but they had never figured out how to compress it to the density that human engineers had achieved. When the missiles struck the exposed hull of the Eternal Glory, they released energy equivalent to small stars, and the explosions tore through armor plating that was supposed to be impenetrable. The bridge of the eternal glory erupted in chaos as alarms screamed and systems failed. The Kaldrith tactical officer was shouting that shields were down to 40%, and he could not understand how these primitive weapons were cutting through their defenses. Vexenor gripped his command throne as the ship shuddered and bucked under the sustained assault. He ordered evasive maneuvers and demanded that his weapons officer return fire, but the humans were already moving. UNS Defiance led a formation of destroyers in a pattern the Kaldrith had never seen before, and the human ships moved through space with an agility that seemed impossible for vessels of their size. They wove between the Kaldrith's weapons fire in coordinated chaos, and every move was calculated to keep them in the dreadnought's blind spots. The human ships were smaller and faster, and most importantly, they fought like nothing the Empire had ever encountered. Captain Jake Morrison watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction, as his plan unfolded exactly as they had rehearsed 100 times in simulations. He ordered his weapons officer to target the Eternal Glory's gun ports and not give the enemy a chance to get a clean shot. The Defiance shook as its railguns fired, and the magnetic accelerators launched metal slugs at a fraction of light speed. The projectiles hammered into the Kaldrith ship from a dozen angles, and each impact sent shockwaves through the enemy vessel's structure. Commander Lisa Grant worked her console with fierce concentration and directed the fleet's movements with the precision of a surgeon. She had studied the data from the alien probe for years, and she knew exactly where the Kaldrith ships were vulnerable. The weapons ports were heavily armored, but the mechanisms that opened and closed them were delicate, and once they were damaged, the massive guns inside became useless. She called out target coordinates and watched with satisfaction as human weapons found their marks again and again. The human fleet moved like a school of fish, and each ship anticipated the other's movements through a combination of artificial intelligence, coordination, and pilot instinct. They had trained together for years, and they knew each other's habits and reflexes. When the Defiance rolled to avoid incoming fire, 3 other ships moved to cover its position. When a destroyer's shields failed, its squadron mates closed ranks to protect it. The Kaldrith fought as individuals, but the humans fought as one organism. Colonel Ben Hayes commanded the UNS Retribution, and it was a heavy cruiser that had been designed specifically for this moment. The ship was built around a massive plasma cannon that drew power directly from its fusion reactor, and Ben had been waiting his entire career to use it against a real target. He brought his ship alongside the Eternal Glory at what would have been point-blank range in any naval battle, and he ordered all batteries to focus fire on a single section of the enemy hull. The concentrated firepower punched through the Kaldrith dreadnought's secondary armor like a hammer through wet paper. Atmosphere vented into space in great plumes of frozen air, and the explosive decompression carried Kaldrith crew members with it. They tumbled into the void in their dozens, and their suits were not designed for combat damage. Ben watched them die without emotion, because these were the same beings who had threatened to exterminate his entire species. Admiral Vexenor realized with growing horror that his mighty dreadnought was being taken apart piece by piece. His crew was dying around him, and his ship was burning, and nothing he did seemed to slow the human assault. He had fought against species with advanced technology and clever tactics, but the humans combined both with a viciousness that shocked him. They were not trying to disable his ship or force a surrender. They were trying to kill everyone aboard. He ordered his communications officer to send a distress signal to the main Kaldrith fleet and call for immediate reinforcements. The Empire had dozens of dreadnoughts and hundreds of smaller warships, and surely this human victory was only possible because they had achieved surprise. Once the Empire knew what it was facing, they would send an overwhelming force and crush these upstarts properly. Lieutenant Amy Price intercepted the Kaldrith transmission, and she routed it to Captain Morrison with a grim smile. The enemy was calling for help, and that meant they knew they were beaten. Jake listened to the desperate message, and he felt no sympathy. These aliens had come to Earth planning to enslave his entire species, and now they were crying for rescue. He opened a channel to all human ships, and his voice was cold and hard. He told the fleet that the Kaldrith wanted a demonstration of human capabilities, and it was time to give them one. He said that the Empire needed to learn what happened when you threatened Earth and her people. Every ship in the fleet knew what he meant. They had all lost friends and family in the colony wars and the resource conflicts. They had all grown up knowing that humanity was alone in a vast and uncaring universe, and now they had a chance to show that alone did not mean weak. The order went out to finish it, and the human fleet converged on the eternal glory like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Railguns and plasma cannons and missile batteries all fired in perfect synchronization. Laser batteries carved glowing lines across the dreadnought's hull, and explosives tore open compartments to expose them to vacuum. The great ship that had conquered worlds and destroyed fleets began to break apart under the relentless assault. Vexnor gave the order to abandon ship, and he felt shame burn through him like acid. In his long career he had never retreated and never surrendered, and certainly never abandoned his command. But his ship was dying and his crew deserved a chance to survive. Escape pods began launching from the eternal glory, and they scattered in all directions as the crew fled for their lives. Commander Lisa Grant asked Captain Morrison if they should destroy the escape pods and prevent any survivors from reporting back to the Empire. It would be the tactically sound decision because dead enemies could not reveal human capabilities or warn their leaders about what had happened. Jake considered it for a long moment while he watched the pods fleeing on his tactical display. He shook his head and said to let them go. Let them return to their empire and tell the story of what happened when they threatened humanity. Let every Kaldrith commander hear about how the mighty eternal glory was destroyed by primitive humans, who were supposed to be easy prey. Let the fear spread through their ranks and make them think twice before they sent more ships to Earth. The escape pods vanished into the darkness of space, and behind them the eternal glory burned. Secondary explosions rippled through the hull as the fusion reactor lost containment and the great ship broke in half. Debris scattered across thousands of kilometers, and the pride of the Kaldrith Armada became nothing more than wreckage and memories. The human fleet regrouped and damage reports came in. 3 destroyers had taken heavy damage and would need weeks of repair. 2 frigates had been destroyed with all hands lost. 600 human lives had been spent to win this victory. Jake Morrison read the casualty list and felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders. They had won, but the cost was real, and those 600 people had families and friends who would grieve. But Earth was safe for now, and humanity had proven that they could fight and win against superior technology. The galaxy had just learned that humans were not prey. They were predators, and they would defend their home with everything they had. Admiral Vexnor had come to conquer, and instead he fled in an escape pod while his ship burned. The message could not have been clearer. The loss of the eternal glory sent shockwaves through the Kaldrith Empire that rippled across dozens of star systems within hours of the battle. Never in 3,000 years of Imperial history had they suffered such a humiliating and total defeat at the hands of a species they considered primitives. The warrior caste demanded immediate retaliation, and the political class scrambled to understand how their greatest warship had been destroyed so easily. Supreme Commander Drakthar was given emergency powers to assemble an armada that would crush the human infestation once and for all. Thar was a legend among the Kaldrith military, and he had commanded fleets for over 2 centuries. He had broken the resistance of the Torn Collective and shattered the defenses of the Helian Confederacy. Under his leadership, the Empire had expanded to control over 40 star systems and subjugated 8 different species. He was not a warrior who accepted defeat or tolerated failure. When he learned that Admiral Vexnor had lost his ship to humans, he felt both rage and disbelief. How could a species that barely had faster-than-light travel destroy a dreadnought that had survived a millennium of warfare? He gathered 500 warships at the edge of human space, and it was the largest fleet the Empire had assembled in over a century. There were battle cruisers with weapons that could crack planets and carriers that held thousands of fighter craft. There were dreadnoughts even larger than the Eternal Glory and siege platforms designed to bombard worlds into submission. This force had shattered entire civilizations and reduced defiant species to ash and memory. Surely these upstart humans would crumble before such overwhelming might. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood in the war room deep beneath the Colorado Rockies and studied the holographic display that showed the incoming Kaldrith fleet. She was 50 years old with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had spent 30 years in military intelligence before taking command of Earth's defensive strategy, and she had been planning for this moment since the first alien probe was detected. She knew that humanity's victory over the Eternal Glory would not be the end, but rather the beginning of a much larger conflict. General Chris Palmer stood beside her, and his weathered face showed deep concern as he studied the fleet composition. He was a ground forces commander who had fought in every major conflict of the past 20 years, and he understood the mathematics of warfare. The Kaldrith outnumbered the human fleet 3-1, and even with technological advantages, those were difficult odds. He said as much to Kate and waited for her response. Kate nodded slowly and told him that they would not fight the Empire head-on, because that would be suicide regardless of their weapons advantage. Instead, they would make the Kaldrith come to them through the outer solar system, and they would bleed the enemy fleet every step of the way. She had studied ancient Earth military history extensively, and she particularly admired the guerrilla tactics used by smaller forces against larger occupying armies. The principle was simple: avoid direct confrontation and strike where the enemy is weakest, then disappear before they can respond. The Kaldrith Armada entered human territory with the confidence that came from 3 millennia of unbroken victory. Supreme Commander Drakthar expected token resistance followed by a brief battle and then total victory. He had deployed his fleet in a traditional imperial formation, with the heaviest ships at the center and lighter vessels screening the flanks. It was a formation that had worked for thousands of years against dozens of enemies. What he got instead was a nightmare that defied all his experience and training. The first attack came from seemingly empty space near Neptune's orbit. Human ships equipped with advanced stealth technology appeared from nowhere and launched devastating strikes against the Kaldrith supply vessels that carried fuel and ammunition for the fleet. The missiles struck with pinpoint accuracy, and the supply ships exploded in brilliant fireballs that lit up the darkness. Before the Kaldrith could respond, the human ships vanished again as if they had never existed. Drakthar ordered his fleet to pursue, but the humans were already gone. His sensors showed nothing but empty space and scattered debris. He increased the alert level and positioned his warships to protect the remaining supply convoy. 2 hours later, the humans struck again from a completely different direction and destroyed 3 more supply vessels before vanishing. The attacks continued throughout the day, and each one was perfectly timed to maximize confusion and damage. Captain Jake Morrison led the UNS Defiance in another hit-and-run attack near the asteroid belt. His ship dropped out of stealth mode long enough to launch a full spread of quantum missiles at a Kaldrith ammunition transport, then jumped back into faster-than-light travel before the enemy escorts could lock weapons. The transport exploded with such force that it damaged 2 nearby warships and killed hundreds of Kaldrith crew. Lieutenant Amy Price coordinated the jump calculations with practiced efficiency, and her fingers flew across her console as she plotted their next emergence point. The crew had been running these raids for 6 days straight with minimal rest, and everyone was exhausted, but they knew their work was making a difference. Every supply ship destroyed meant the Kaldrith fleet had less fuel and fewer weapons. Every successful raid meant the enemy was that much weaker for the final battle. Supreme Commander Drakthar grew increasingly frustrated as his mighty armada was picked apart by an enemy he could not see or catch. His tactical officer, Sub-Commander Lintha, reported that they had lost 37 ships without ever seeing the main human fleet. The humans were using cowards' tactics and refusing to face the Empire in honorable combat. Drakthar slammed his fist against his command throne and declared that when he finally caught these humans, he would make them pay for every ship they had destroyed. But the raids continued without pause, and the Kaldrith fleet began to suffer from supply shortages. Warships had to reduce speed to conserve fuel, and weapon systems were placed on rationing protocols. Morale began to drop as crew members realized they were being hunted like prey animals. The Empire's warriors had never experienced this kind of warfare, and they did not know how to counter an enemy that refused to stand and fight. Colonel Ben Hayes commanded a strike group of 20 ships that specialized in hit-and-run tactics. They had been operating independently for a week and had destroyed over a dozen Kaldrith vessels without taking a single casualty. Ben was a master of unconventional warfare, and he took pride in finding creative ways to hurt the enemy. His latest plan involved using the gravity well of Jupiter to mask their approach and strike. At the Kaldrith fleet's communication relays, the attack went perfectly, and the human ships emerged from behind Jupiter's massive bulk to destroy 3 relay stations before the Kaldrith even knew they were under attack. Without those relays, the enemy fleet lost its ability to coordinate between different squadrons, and Supreme Commander Drakthar found himself commanding a force that could barely communicate with itself. For 2 weeks, the Kaldrith Armada pushed deeper into human space, and for 2 weeks, they bled ships and supplies and morale. They lost vessels to mines hidden in asteroid fields that activated only when Kaldrith ships passed nearby. They lost entire squadrons to ambushes in the outer planets where human ships used the complex gravity fields to outmaneuver their pursuers. They lost scout ships to boarding parties that struck without warning and vanished into the void. By the time Drakthar reached Saturn's orbit, he had lost over 100 ships, and his confidence was badly shaken. His fleet was low on ammunition and fuel, and his crews were exhausted from constant alert status. And waiting for him at Saturn, arrayed in perfect battle formation, was the full might of the human fleet. 400 warships hung in space around the ringed planet, and their weapons were armed and ready. Admiral Kate Sullivan sat in the command chair of the UNS Constitution and watched the battered Kaldrith fleet approach. Her plan had worked better than she had hoped, and the enemy was weak and demoralized and far from their supply lines. She opened a communication channel to Supreme Commander Drakthar, and her voice was calm and professional. She told him that he had come a long way to die, and she was offering him one chance to retreat back to Kaldrith space. If he accepted her offer, his fleet would be allowed to leave and no more Kaldrith would die today. If he refused, then she would destroy every ship in his armada and send his bodies back to the Empire as a message. The choice was his, but she would only make the offer once. Drakthar stared at the human admiral on his screen and felt rage burn through his exhaustion. His pride would not allow him to retreat from primitives, no matter how clever their tactics had been. He had been given orders to crush humanity, and he would fulfill those orders or die trying. He closed the channel without responding and turned to his fleet commanders. He ordered all ships to attack formation and declared that they would end this now. Admiral Kate Sullivan watched the Kaldrith fleet begin its attack run, and she sighed quietly. She had given them a chance to leave, and they had refused it. Now she would show them the true cost of threatening Earth. She opened a fleet-wide channel and gave the order that every human captain had been waiting to hear. Execute Battle Plan Omega and show no mercy. The Battle of Saturn would be remembered as the turning point in human history, and the moment when Earth's people proved they belonged among the stars. 400 human warships faced off against the remaining Kaldrith Armada of 363 vessels that had survived the brutal journey through the outer solar system. The numbers were closer than they had been at the start, but they did not tell the full story of what was about to happen. Supreme Commander Drakthar watched from his flagship as the human fleet split into multiple formations, and each group moved with precise coordination that spoke of extensive training and planning. The humans had studied Kaldrith tactics during their guerrilla campaign, and they had learned how the Empire fought. Now they were ready to counter every traditional strategy that had won the Kaldrith thousands of victories over 3 millennia. Drakthar felt a cold sense of dread settle in his chest as he realized these humans were not the primitives he had been told to expect. The UNS Defiance led the vanguard, and Captain Jake Morrison pushed his ship and crew to their absolute limits. He had been fighting for 2 weeks straight with minimal rest, and his body ached with exhaustion, but his mind was sharp and focused. This battle would decide everything. Either humanity would break the Kaldrith Empire's power, or Earth would face invasion and possible extinction. There was no middle ground and no room for error. He ordered all power redirected to forward shields and told his helmsman to punch through the Kaldrith line at maximum speed. The Defiance accelerated toward the enemy formation like a missile, and behind it came 50 other human ships in tight formation. Commander Lisa Grant worked her tactical console with fierce determination, and her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision. She locked firing solutions on 3 separate Kaldrith cruisers and deployed the newest generation of plasma torpedoes. The Kai torpedoes were a human innovation that combined multiple technologies the Kaldrith had always considered incompatible. They used quantum phase shifting to pass through enemy shields as if the barriers were not even there, and then detonated inside the target vessel's hull. The explosions tore ships apart from within, and there was no defense against weapons that ignored shields completely. 3 Kaldrith cruisers vanished in cascading fireballs, and the shockwaves damaged nearby vessels. Colonel Ben Hayes brought the UNS Retribution alongside a Kaldrith battlecruiser and unleashed his full arsenal at point-blank range. Every weapon system on his ship fired simultaneously, and the concentrated firepower cut the enemy vessel in half. He shouted for Earth as his plasma cannon carved a glowing line through the battlecruiser's reactor core. The explosion was bright enough to be seen from Saturn's surface, and debris scattered across thousands of kilometers. But the Keldrith fought back with desperate fury, and they had centuries of combat experience behind them. Their energy beams carved through human shields like knives through paper, and their kinetic projectiles smashed into human hulls with devastating force. The UNS Valiant took a direct hit to its bridge, and the entire command section exploded. The ship tumbled away, venting atmosphere and bodies. The UNS Horizon was struck by 3 missiles simultaneously and broke apart in a spectacular fireball that killed 400 crew members in an instant. Admiral Kate Sullivan watched the battle unfold from her command ship, and her face remained calm despite the chaos on the tactical displays. She had wargamed this scenario 1,000 times, and she knew that victories came with costs. Every ship lost hurt her heart, but she could not allow emotion to cloud her judgment. She ordered reserve squadrons to move up and support Sector 7, where the fighting was heaviest. Her orders were relayed across the fleet with calm efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Foster sat at the communications console and coordinated fleet movements with the same calm precision he brought to everything. He was 26 years old, and this was his first major battle, but he refused to let fear affect his performance. He relayed Admiral Sullivan's orders to squadron commanders and tracked damage reports as they came in. Ships were dying, but the fleet maintained cohesion, and that was what mattered most. The battle raged for 6 brutal hours, and space around Saturn became a graveyard of shattered vessels and floating debris. Both sides fought with everything they had, and both sides took terrible losses. Human tactics proved superior as smaller ships used their agility to outmaneuver larger Keldrith vessels. Human technology proved deadlier as quantum weapons and gravity mines inflicted damage that the Empire had no counter for. But most importantly, human determination proved unbreakable as crew after crew refused to surrender, even when their ships were crippled and burning. Supreme Commander Drakthar watched his mighty armada disintegrate around him, and he could not comprehend how this had happened. His flagship, the Imperial Fist, was burning from a dozen wounds, and half the bridge crew was dead or dying. Smoke filled the command center, and alarms screamed warnings about failing systems. Reports came in from across the fleet, and every single one told the same story. They were losing badly, and there was no way to turn the tide. Sub-Commander Linda worked frantically to keep critical systems online, but the damage was too extensive. She turned to Drakthar with fear in her 4 eyes and told him they had to withdraw immediately. If they stayed in the battle much longer, the entire fleet would be annihilated, and the Empire would lose hundreds of ships and thousands of trained warriors. The loss would cripple Imperial military power for decades. Drakthar stared at the tactical display and saw that over half his fleet was already destroyed or disabled. The remaining ships were battered and running low on ammunition. The humans showed no signs of slowing their assault, and their losses had been lighter than his own despite the ferocity of the combat. For the first time in his long military career, he faced a truth that shook him to his core. The Keldrith Empire was not invincible, and these humans had proven it beyond any doubt. He gave the order that would haunt him for the rest of his life. All ships were to retreat immediately and fall back to Imperial space. The fleet was to disengage from combat and jump to faster-than-light travel as soon as they were clear of Saturn's gravity well. It was a full retreat, and it meant abandoning damaged ships that could not jump. It meant leaving wounded warriors behind to be captured or killed. But it was the only way to save what remained of his armada. The Keldrith ships broke formation and fled toward the outer system. Human ships pursued and continued firing until the enemy vessels jumped away one by one. Within 30 minutes, the battle was over, and the space around Saturn fell, silent except for the crackling of damaged ships and the hiss of venting atmosphere. Captain Jake Morrison slumped in his command chair and felt exhaustion wash over him like a physical weight. His hands were shaking and his uniform was soaked with sweat. Lieutenant Amy Price called out casualty figures in a voice heavy with grief. The human fleet had lost 68 ships completely destroyed, and another 14 were so badly damaged they would never fight again. Estimated casualties were over 42,000 men and women who had given their lives to protect Earth. The victory had been costly, but it had been absolute and total. The Keldrith Empire that had ruled for 3,000 years had been broken by humanity. Their mighty fleet had been shattered and their supreme commander had fled in disgrace. Every species in the galaxy would hear about what happened at Saturn, and they would know that humans were not to be trifled with. Admiral Kate Sullivan addressed the surviving fleet over an open channel. She told them to stand down from combat alert and begin rescue operations for damaged vessels. She said that they had done humanity proud today and secured their future among the stars. Every person in the fleet had fought with courage and skill, and Earth would remember their sacrifice forever. Her voice was steady, but those who knew her could hear the emotion underneath. But even as the human fleet began the grim work of counting their dead and rescuing survivors, Kate knew this was not truly over. An empire did not fall from a single defeat, no matter how devastating. The Kaldrith would return to their home worlds and report what had happened. They would debate and argue and plan their next move. The question was whether they would seek revenge or sue for peace. Kate suspected the answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and she ordered her intelligence officers to monitor all communications from Kaldrith space. 3 days later, her suspicions proved correct when an unexpected transmission reached Earth. The message came not from a military commander, but from the Kaldrith Imperial Council itself. They requested a diplomatic channel to discuss terms, not demands or ultimatums, but terms. The word choice was significant, and Kate felt a grim satisfaction. The Empire was ready to talk because they were afraid of what would happen if the fighting continued. 3 days after the Battle of Saturn, an unexpected transmission reached Earth that caught every human leader by surprise. The Kaldrith Imperial Council, which was the ruling body of the entire empire, requested a diplomatic channel to discuss terms of peace. It was not a demand or an ultimatum, but an actual request, and the word choice told experienced diplomats everything they needed to know about how badly the empire had been shaken by their defeats. Admiral Kate Sullivan, along with Captain Jake Morrison and Colonel Ben Hayes, were summoned to Geneva for what would be the most important conversation in human history. They gathered in a secure conference room deep beneath the United Nations building and waited as technicians set up the holographic projectors that would allow real-time communication across light years of space. Kate felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders because what happened in the next hour could determine humanity's future for centuries to come. The holographic projectors flickered to life, and the face that appeared was ancient by any standard that humans could measure. High Counselor Vormak had led the Kaldrith Empire for 5 centuries, and his 4 eyes held wisdom earned through ages of rule. But those eyes also held something that no Kaldrith leader had shown in 3,000 years. They held fear and uncertainty, and the knowledge that his empire was no longer invincible. Vormak spoke, and the translator software rendered his words in perfect English. He began by acknowledging that the empire had gravely underestimated humanity and made assumptions based on limited information. The Kaldrith had seen a young species taking its first steps into space and assumed they would be easy to conquer. They had been wrong, and the cost of that mistake had been severe. Kate leaned forward in her chair, and her voice was cold when she responded. She reminded Vormak that his empire had threatened humanity with complete extinction and attacked Earth without provocation. The Kaldrith had come prepared to enslave or destroy an entire species, and now they wanted to talk only because they had lost. She asked what exactly the Empire expected from this conversation. Vormak did not try to justify or excuse what his empire had done, and that surprised the human delegation. He simply stated that the Kaldrith wanted to survive, and they understood now that they could not survive a prolonged war with humanity. The Empire's fleet was shattered and its commanders were dead or disgraced. More importantly, the Kaldrith had seen what humans were capable of achieving, and they recognized a strength they could not match through traditional warfare. Jake Morrison spoke up, and his voice carried the hardness of a man who had watched friends die in battle. He asked if the Empire was offering surrender terms and reminded Vormak that the Kaldrith had conquered 17 other species over the centuries. Those species had been enslaved and exploited, and now the Empire wanted mercy because they found themselves on the losing side for once. Vormak met Jake's gaze steadily and admitted that yes, the Empire was asking for mercy. He explained that the Kaldrith had ruled through strength for 3,000 years, and they had never encountered a species that could challenge them militarily. But humanity had shown them a different kind of strength, Humans adapted faster than any species the Empire had ever known, and they innovated in ways that seemed impossible. Most importantly, humans fought with a ferocity that came not from a desire to conquer but from a need to protect what was theirs. Colonel Ben Hayes crossed his arms and asked what prevented humanity from pressing their advantage. The human fleet could strike at Kaldrith worlds while the Empire was still recovering from its losses. They could take revenge for the unprovoked attack and ensure the Kaldrith never threatened anyone again. Why should Earth show mercy to an empire that had shown none to others? Vormok acknowledged that humanity had every right to seek revenge, and the Empire could not stop them if they chose that path. But he asked them to consider what they would become in the process. The Kaldrith had started their expansion 3 millennia ago with noble intentions of bringing order to a chaotic galaxy. Over time, those intentions had been corrupted by power, and the Empire had become the very thing they had originally opposed. He warned that humanity could follow the same path if they chose conquest over coexistence. Kate studied the ancient alien leader and considered his words carefully. She had spent 30 years in military intelligence, and she knew how to recognize genuine fear versus manipulation. Vormok was afraid, and his fear was real, but he was also making a calculated appeal to human morality. The question was whether humanity could afford to be merciful to an empire that had proven itself ruthless and aggressive. She outlined humanity's terms in a clear and firm voice. The Kaldrith Empire would withdraw from all human space immediately and recognize Earth's sovereignty over every system humanity had claimed. The Empire would release any human prisoners or assets they had taken during their attacks. They would pay reparations for the 42,000 lives lost in the battles and provide resources to help rebuild the damaged fleet. Most importantly, the Empire would formally recognize humanity as an equal power and never again treat them as potential subjects or slaves. Vormok bowed his head in a gesture that the translator identified as acceptance and submission. He agreed to all the terms without argument or negotiation, but then he asked for something in return that caught the human delegation completely off guard. He requested an alliance between humanity and the Kaldrith Empire. Jake laughed bitterly at the suggestion and asked how the Empire could possibly expect humans to ally with them after everything that had happened. Vormok had just admitted that the Kaldrith had come to Earth planning genocide, and now he wanted friendship. The idea seemed absurd on its face, but Vormok explained his reasoning with a patience that came from centuries of political experience. The galaxy was vast, and there were threats far greater than either the Empire or humanity alone. There were species in the outer reaches that made the Kaldrith look peaceful by comparison. There were ancient civilizations that viewed younger races as resources to be harvested. If humanity could achieve what they had done in mere decades of space travel, then given time they might become the galaxy's greatest protectors. The Empire had been strong through conquest, but humanity could be strong through unity and cooperation. Kate exchanged glances with Jake and Ben, and she could see the same conflicting emotions on their faces. The logical part of her mind recognized that an alliance with the Kaldrith would give humanity access to 3,000 years of knowledge and technology. It would provide security from other threats while Earth continued to expand and develop. But the emotional part of her wanted to reject any deal with beings who had threatened to exterminate her species. She told Vormok that humanity would take his proposal to the United Nations for consideration. It was not something that 3 military officers could decide on their own, regardless of their authority. But she made one thing absolutely clear to the High Counselor. If the Kaldrith Empire ever threatened humanity again or broke the terms they were agreeing to, then there would be no mercy offered a second time. Humanity would erase the Empire from the galaxy entirely and leave nothing but dust and memories. Vormok met her gaze, and his ancient eyes showed complete understanding. He said that the Empire had no doubt about humanity's ability to carry out that threat, and that knowledge would keep the peace better than any treaty. Fear could be a powerful motivator when it was backed by demonstrated capability. The transmission ended, and the 3 humans sat in silence for several minutes. Ben Hayes was the first to speak, and he asked if they could really trust the Kaldrith to keep their word. Kate admitted she did not know, but pointed out that the Empire had little choice. They had lost over half their fleet, and their reputation for invincibility was shattered. Every species in the galaxy would hear about what happened at Saturn, and the political implications would ripple through imperial space for years. The Kaldrith needed peace as much as humanity did. 3 weeks later, the Treaty of Geneva was signed in a ceremony broadcast across human space and transmitted to dozens of alien civilizations. The Kaldrith Empire formally recognized humanity as a sovereign power and agreed to all the terms Kate had outlined. Diplomatic channels were opened and preliminary trade discussions began. Cultural exchange programs were proposed and scientific cooperation was tentatively explored. But everyone involved understood that trust would take generations to build. The memory of those 42,000 dead humans would not fade quickly, and neither would the knowledge that the Kaldrith had come to Earth planning enslavement or genocide. The alliance was born from pragmatic necessity, rather than genuine friendship. Still, it marked the beginning of a new era. Humanity was no longer alone in the galaxy and no longer unknown. The Battle of Saturn was told and retold across dozens of worlds. In bars on space stations, spacers spoke in hushed tones about the humans who had crushed an empire that had ruled for 3 millennia. In military academies across multiple species, young officers studied human tactics with equal parts admiration and dread. In the halls of power on 100 planets, leaders asked themselves the same question that kept them awake at night: if humanity could achieve this much while confined to a single star system, then what would they be capable of in a century when they controlled dozens of systems? What would they accomplish in a millennium when they had the resources of hundreds of worlds behind them? The humans had announced their arrival on the galactic stage by defeating an enemy that everyone had thought unbeatable. Kate Sullivan stood in her office and looked out at the stars through the reinforced windows. Earth was safe and humanity had secured its place among the spacefaring civilizations. But she knew this was just the beginning. There would be other challenges and other threats. There would be species that saw humanity's rapid rise as a danger to be eliminated. The galaxy was vast and ancient, and humanity was still very young. But they had proven something important in the fires of battle. They had shown that being young did not mean being weak. They had demonstrated that rapid advancement and creative thinking could overcome raw power and ancient technology. Most importantly, they had established that humanity would fight to protect what was theirs, and they would win. Those fights through courage and innovation and unbreakable determination. The age of Kaldrith dominance was over, and a new age was beginning. It was an age where humanity would play a central role in shaping the future of the galaxy. And every species from the youngest to the most ancient would remember the lesson that Earth had taught. Never underestimate the humans because they would make you regret it.